with everything you've got, with all your being. And if he does, I will bless you. And he says in verse 9, you should teach them to your children. And this is a verse that's been quoted. I know that Matt or Jordan one, I can never remember which one had the sermon, but one of them had a sermon earlier in the year basically using this. You shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by your way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Now think about it. Moses is telling these people whose parents are gone, who's about ready to possess the promised land, it's you. I'm telling you, I'm recounting this story for you. And why am I recounting this story for you? Why am I establishing that if you obey God, you'll be blessed? If you don't obey God, you'll be punished? Why am I doing that? Because I want you to remember it. And I want you to tell your children that. And I want you to tell your children's children that. Why? So it doesn't get forgotten. We're going to find when we get to the book of Judges, they must not have listened to that part. Because at some point, they just completely fall away. Over and over again. Which is a good comment on the mercy of God. That's what he's saying, and that's why that's important. He describes what type of worship he wants in Deuteronomy 12 as opposed to idolatry worship. So he's drawing a comparison there, which is another great lesson out of that chapter, is a great lesson in itself, but he's just drawing a comparison of what it's like to be an idol worshiper and what type of worship he wants. Doesn't he do the same thing for us today? He tells us how he wants us to worship. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him how? In spirit and in truth. With the right heart. With the way I've told you. There's countless examples, no greater than Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, who didn't worship according to the way God asked them to worship. They were destroyed at that point, and they lost their lives. God's in this, he's saying, there's a way I want to be worshiped. It's going to start with your heart, but there's certain things I expect. A lot more requirements than maybe is even expected of us today in our worship. But start with the heart, but this is the way. That is not idol worship. So if you find yourself worshiping in a way where you're exalting something besides God in front of you, that's not what I want. That's the context of what's going on in chapter 12. Chapter 13 says, and beware, there's going to be some people come, there are going to be false prophets, and they're going to try to take you away from the way I want you to worship. You got to beware. And they will be punished, he says in that chapter. He's telling you, you got to beware. Are we told anything about that today? Of course. They could come in from among you even, he says. And how do they come in from among you? As wolves in sheep's clothing. The principle of being aware that there could be people, false teachers, is trying to pull you away. In this case, he's talking about trying to pull you away from the kind of worship I want you to have. You got to be careful for them. You got to be aware of them. Again, another New Testament principle that's established here in the book of Deuteronomy. Following that, then, he goes through a series of laws, which we're just going to go through quickly. There's a whole series of laws. Chapter 14, the law of clean and unclean meat, which we've talked about before, principles around giving or tithing. They've all got great verses you could draw from. Chapter 15 talks about how you treat the poor, how you treat your servants. He talks in this case about your responsibility to help them, that you can't harden your heart if they're in need. He's saying that if you help other people, he's going to bless you. He says in verses 5 and 6. And this also is the one about bondservants. This is a verse I think we sing a song, Andy. Pierce my ear. Okay, that's from reference out of this chapter 15, verse 17, where he talks about you can take an owl. If it's bondservant has decided that they want to stay, even though after 7 years they could be freed, but they want to stay with you, then they're to pierce their ear with an awl. And that's what that song I think is saying, Andy, is we pierce our soul, right? That's our commitment. That's our similarity to this verse of what we do to commit ourselves to Christ. So a great set of verses to read at some point. Verse 16 talks about Passover, Feast of Weeks, which is the 7 weeks following Passover, which is when Pentecost occurs, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, just to repeat those feasts. Feast of Tabernacles, by the way, is to commemorate their wandering in the wilderness. I realize I didn't put that on the slide. Chapter 17 is about laws around capital punishment. I find it interesting. They also talked about how a king and his duties should be. They didn't have a king at that time, but we know as history played out, they did. Avoid the wickedness of the land in Deuteronomy 18. And then Deuteronomy 18, I've got to read these verses. Verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. Going down to verse 18, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I'll require it of him. I think it's one of the most important verses in the book of Deuteronomy, because that's a prophecy of Christ. Lord your God will raise you up a prophet, he says in 18 and 15. When Paul was looking for when Jesus was looking for the apostles, Philip came to Nathanael and said to him, we have found him whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote. And who is he? Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth. Think about that. Jesus is just gathering his apostles at this point. And what do they recognize? This man, Jesus, is who Moses talked about thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago. This man, Jesus, is that prophet that was going to be raised up among us. Is going to be part of that. I'll raise him a prophet like you from among the brethren, and will put my words in his mouth. Hebrews 12:25. See that you do not refuse him who speaks, for they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth. Much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks it from heaven. Verse 24, stating that Jesus is the moderator of a new covenant. That's the perceived thing. He's saying in Hebrews that if they didn't listen to Moses, and they didn't escape, think how bad it's going to be if we don't listen to this prophet, to Jesus. How shall we escape? Earlier in Hebrews, he says, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? I think it's 2 verse 3 or 2 verse 4. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? He's established, in fact, that this is the prophet. We've got that established already because they recognize that. Now we're saying you need to listen to his words, because where do the words come from? I put them there. In John, somewhere 14, 15, 16, it says, I speak the words that I spoke. How can you say that I am not of the Father when I only say what the Father said to say? So we know that Jesus is a prophet that was talked about in Deuteronomy 18. We now know that the words he spoke are the words from God. And then we find out that if you don't hear them, you're going to be destroyed. I find it interesting that Peter in his sermon in Acts chapter 3 goes through this whole story, and he says, and if you don't listen to this man, if you don't listen to the words of Jesus, you're going to be destroyed. Exactly the same principle that they were told in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 18. Jesus said himself, that his coming to this earth was to fulfill that old law. I can't remember. I think it was 332 prophecies that Jesus was to fulfill. I think that's the right number that somebody said. 332 prophecies that Jesus was to fulfill. Jesus is telling you right here, and this is one of them. This is one of the things that I fulfill. I am the prophet that Moses talked about. I speak the words that God gave me to speak to you. And the Comforter is going to come and leave you with those words we have. And if you don't listen to them, you're going to be punished. It's that simple. That is the prophecy. I'd like to go ahead to the rest of it, but I think we need to pause at this point because I have no way of getting through the rest of the book. We'll do this and pick up with Joshua, start the books of history at our lesson next week. Are any comments or observations you'd like to make before we close class? Yes, Ron.
Well, as a Christian studying the Old Testament, which is something we do all need to do, it's scary about how we look back on our forefathers, Moses and all the apostles and everything, and see what they warned us about, that we are to fear God. We love God, and God is love. But sometimes as Christians, we put that totally over and above all other things and forget that we are to fear God also. If we go against the Word of God and we follow the way of man and we follow the teachings and the gods of men, we're no different than they were back then, and God becomes angry, and we need to be careful. I can say I'm a good Christian and not live a good Christian life. Yeah. That doesn't mean I'm a good Christian. It means I'm a person that's telling myself and others a lie.
Yeah. Well, the purpose of this study was not to do an in-depth study of every book, and I've probably taken it more deeper than was originally intended when Kyle asked me to do this. But the purpose of this is for us to get a reflection of the fact that we say God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And this proves this point. Because the yesterday we're studying. Today we're living. The forever is when we get to our promised land. And that's the purpose, of understanding that the nature of God is not changed. If we read this and we scoff at those people and say, "My, I wouldn't do that," what does that tell us? Here's the good part. Here's the good part. So what else have we seen? What else have we seen in just what we've talked about this morning? God's merciful. He recognizes the nature of man. He knows we're going to make mistakes, and He's merciful to us. He just wants us to remember that it's His mercy that allows that, not what we do ourselves. Appreciate the comment, Ron. Appreciate your attention in class, and we look forward to next week's study. We'll wrap up Deuteronomy and try to cover Joshua, maybe.